The morning sun rose over Delta Air Force Base like a golden promise, but the air thrummed with palpable tension. It was D-Day for the C-29 Aurora, the experimental supersonic fighter that had become the nightmare of veteran pilots and the obsession of the nation's brightest aeronautical engineers. Over the past 6 months, 3 experienced pilots had failed miserably in simulations, and 2 others had flatly refused to attempt a real flight after seeing the aircraft's technical data. At the center of this maelstrom of bruised egos and military pride stood Captain Dante Reyes, a man whose reputation had been forged in the crucible of discipline and tempered in the fires of technical perfection. His medals gleamed on his chest like stars won in battles against mediocrity, and his sharp gaze had ended more careers than many wars. Dante tolerated no mistakes, accepted no excuses, and above all, couldn't stand anyone questioning his competence or authority. "Gentlemen," his voice boomed through the hangar like controlled thunder, "this project has consumed 2 years of our lives and $40 million in resources. The Aurora isn't just an aircraft, it's the future of national air supremacy. And I will not allow successive failures to tarnish our reputation." The engineers and officers present nodded silently, but everyone knew the project was on the brink of collapse. The C-29 Aurora was an impossible machine. Its adaptive wings, its hybrid propulsion systems, and its radical aerodynamics defied everything they knew about aviation. It was like trying to tame a mechanical dragon that breathed fire and challenged the laws of physics with every second of flight. It was at this moment of maximum tension that an unlikely figure appeared at the hangar entrance. Elena Vance shouldn't have been there. A widow at 35, mother to 12-year-old Miguel and 8-year-old Sophia, she supported her family with the humble work of a self-taught mechanic in the small town of Oakhaven, 10 miles from the base. Her calloused hands told the story of nights spent disassembling old tractor engines, repairing broken fans, and fixing anything with bolts and gears. That morning, Elena had been called for an emergency service. One of the base's auxiliary generators had developed a strange fault that the official technicians couldn't diagnose. It was a simple, low-paying job, but it would help buy her children's school books. She never imagined that this call would change not only her life, but the history of military aviation. While working silently on the generator, Elena couldn't help but overhear the heated discussions coming from the main hangar. Technical words flew through the air like fragments of an impossible puzzle: longitudinal instability, critical center of gravity, structural resonance. Her natural curiosity, the same one that had led her to disassemble her first radio at age 7, was piqued. During a lunch break, when the military personnel had stepped away, Elena discreetly approached the Aurora. The aircraft was a work of art in metal and technology, but to her eyes, trained on imperfect machines and improvised repairs, something was amiss. She observed the lines of the fuselage, the arrangement of the engines, the curvature of the adaptive wings. It was like looking at a symphony played with out-of-tune notes. "What are you doing here?" Captain Dante's voice made her jump. He had returned early and found her practically embracing the Aurora, her hands delicately touching the surface of the right wing. "Sorry, sir." Elena lowered her eyes, her cheeks flushing with shame. "I was just admiring it. I've never seen such a beautiful machine." "Beautiful and impossible to fly," Dante replied bitterly. "This beautiful machine has ended the careers of 3 of my best pilots." Elena hesitated for a moment, but something deep inside her, perhaps the same force that made her work 16 hours a day to support her children, impelled her to speak. "Sir, with all due respect, I think I know what the problem is." The silence that followed was absolute. The engineers who had returned stopped mid-conversation. Captain Dante narrowed his eyes, his expression oscillating between disbelief and indignation. "You think you know?" His voice carried a cutting irony. "Ma'am, our engineers have degrees from the best universities in the world. Our pilots have flown in real conflicts. And you, a small-town mechanic, think you can solve what they couldn't?" Elena felt the weight of all eyes on her. It was like being back in that military court 20 years ago when her life had crumbled. But this time, she wouldn't bow down. "The problem isn't in the aerodynamics or propulsion," she said, her voice gaining firmness. "It's in the synchronization between the systems. The adaptive wings are responding 0.3 seconds after the pilot's command. It's imperceptible in ground tests, but in the air at supersonic speeds, it creates a cascading instability." Dr. Ramirez, head of the engineering team, scoffed. "Ma'am, that's an absurdly simplistic analysis. Our computers haven't detected any time lag in the systems." "Because you're measuring with digital instruments," Elena retorted. "But machines have a soul of their own. I learned that fixing engines no manual explained how they worked." That's when something extraordinary happened. Elena approached an auxiliary control panel and with precise movements that left the engineer speechless, began making microscopic adjustments to the flight control system's response parameters. "What are you doing?" Dante shouted, but something in his voice had changed. It was no longer just indignation, it was fascination. "I'm creating a compensating lag," Elena explained as she worked. "If the wings respond 0.3 seconds late, then the command system must anticipate 0.3 seconds. It's like playing the piano with an echo. You learn to synchronize with the room's time, not the time of your finger." What happened in the next few minutes defied everything those present believed about aeronautics. Elena, guided by an intuition that seemed supernatural, reconfigured systems that had taken months to program. Her fingers danced across the controls as if she had been born to do this. And then, when she was finished, the hangar fell into absolute silence. "Ready," she said simply, wiping her hands on her simple uniform. Captain Dante looked at her with an expression that mixed admiration and disbelief. His years in the military had taught him to recognize competence when he saw it, but this defied all logic. How could a simple— If this narrative is touching your heart, if you are feeling the same emotion I feel telling Elena's journey, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the notification bell. Stories like this need to be shared. They need to inspire other people who, like Elena, may have buried their dreams but still carry within them the flame of greatness. Your subscription helps us continue telling these stories of overcoming and redemption that the world so desperately needs to hear. Thank you. And now let's return to the sky with Elena. After 47 minutes of flight that would redefine the parameters of experimental aviation, Elena began her approach to landing. Even this final phase was executed with a perfection that bordered on the supernatural. The Aurora touched down with the delicacy of a butterfly landing on a flower, its brakes working in perfect harmony with the systems she had recalibrated. When the aircraft finally stopped, the silence that followed was unlike any other the hangar had ever witnessed. It wasn't the silence of expectation or fear. It was the silence of reverence, the kind of sacred quiet that settles when people witness something truly extraordinary. Elena removed her helmet with slow movements, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders like a waterfall of newfound freedom. Her eyes shone not only with tears of relief, but with an inner light that had been stifled for 2 decades of injustice and silence. She descended from the cockpit with the same grace with which she had flown. And it was then that something unexpected happened. Captain Reyes, the man who had never bowed before anyone, approached slowly and, with tear-filled eyes, removed his hat. "Miss Elena Vance," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I apologize. I apologize for doubting you. I apologize for underestimating you. And I apologize for not immediately recognizing greatness when it was right in front of me." The captain's gesture was like a spark that ignited the entire hangar. One by one, officers, engineers, technicians, and mechanics began to applaud. It wasn't just applause. It was a collective acknowledgement that they had witnessed something that would change their lives forever. But Elena knew her journey wasn't over yet. Among the crowd applauding her, she recognized some familiar faces, people who had been present at her public humiliation 20 years ago. And in the back of the hangar, trying to hide among the civilian observers, was a figure that made her heart race. Colonel Vasconcelos, now a gray-haired man with a somber expression. Vasconcelos had become a successful military consultant after his retirement, building a prosperous career on the ruins of the life he had destroyed. He was there that day not by chance, but because his company had been hired to assess the commercial potential of the Aurora project. When their eyes met across the crowd, Elena saw recognition and fear in them. Vasconcelos knew exactly who she was and understood the devastating implications of her reappearance. "Colonel Vasconcelos," Elena said, her voice cutting through the applause like a sharp blade. "What a surprise to see you here." Silence returned to the hangar, but this time charged with a completely different tension. Those who knew the story felt the air electrify, while the others sensed that something important was about to happen. "Elena Santos," Vasconcelos murmured, his face paling. "Dead? Gone? Destroyed?" Elena finished, taking a step toward him. "No, Colonel. I've been alive all these years, living with the truth you tried to bury." The next 2 hours transformed Delta Air Force Base into an impromptu courtroom. Elena, with the clear mind of someone who had spent 2 decades processing her own pain, began to recount her story. She spoke about the original project she had developed, about the evidence she had uncovered of Vasconcelos' corruption, about the orchestrated betrayal that had destroyed her career. More importantly, she had kept evidence. Documents, recordings, electronic communications that proved her innocence and Vasconcelos' guilt. For years, she had waited for the right moment to use them, but she had never found the courage or the opportunity. Now, before dozens of witnesses, and with her technical competence undeniably demonstrated, Elena finally found her voice. "I could have come here today seeking revenge," she said, her voice echoing through the silent hangar. "I could have used this evidence to destroy Colonel Vasconcelos' life the same way he destroyed mine. But I learned something during these 20 years of exile." Elena paused, her eyes scanning the attentive faces around her. "I learned that true strength isn't in humiliating those who humiliated us, but in rising with dignity. I learned that real justice isn't the one that destroys the guilty, but the one that restores the truth. And I learned that some victories are only valuable when won without staining our own integrity." She turned to Vasconcelos, who had shrunk into a nearby chair, his empire of lies crumbling around him. "Colonel, you will have to live with your choices. I will hand over this evidence to the competent authorities, not out of revenge, but because the truth deserves to be known. But my victory today isn't in your downfall. It's in the fact that I never ceased to be who I truly am." The impact of Elena's revelations reverberated far beyond the walls of Delta Air Force Base. In the following weeks, a military investigation was opened, resulting in the posthumous revocation of Vasconcelos' medals and the complete restoration of Elena's honor. More importantly, the Aurora project was revolutionary, establishing new paradigms for experimental aviation worldwide. Elena was invited to resume her military career with an even higher rank than the... Everyone knew it was an impossible provocation, a cruel way to humiliate someone who had dared to challenge the established hierarchy. No one expected Elena to accept, but she did. "All right," she said, after a long sigh that seemed to carry the weight of a lifetime of silent struggles. "I'll fly." What followed was a moment of silence so profound that you could hear the wind whispering between the parked aircraft. Elena looked around, seeing expressions of shock, disbelief, and even fear on the faces of the military personnel and engineers. She knew she was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. At that moment, memories she had buried deep began to emerge like ghosts from the past. 20 years ago, she wasn't Elena Vance, the self-taught mechanic from Oakhaven. She was Lieutenant Helena Santos, a graduate with honors from the Air Force Academy, a specialist in experimental flight systems and considered one of the brightest minds of her generation. She remembered the excitement of her first solo flights, the feeling of absolute freedom when she was alone with the clouds. She remembered the praise from her instructors, the colleagues who respected her, the bright future that stretched out before her like an endless runway. And she also remembered the night that destroyed everything. It was 2005, and she had been chosen to lead the pilot project of a new autonomous navigation system. For months, she worked almost without sleep, perfecting algorithms, testing prototypes, dreaming of a revolutionary aviation. But Colonel Vasconcelos, her superior officer, had become interested in the project, not for technical merit, but for personal ambition. Elena discovered too late that Vasconcelos was selling technical information to private companies, using her work to illegally enrich himself. When she tried to report him, he acted first. Documents were forged, evidence was planted, witnesses were bought. In a matter of weeks, Elena found herself accused of treason, espionage, and selling military secrets. The trial was a spectacle of public humiliation. All her years of dedication, all her achievements, all her future were destroyed in sessions that were more like moral executions. Her medals were publicly ripped away, her rank was revoked, and she was dishonorably discharged from the Air Force. But the real betrayal came from the person she least expected, John, her fiancé, an officer she planned to marry after the project's completion. Instead of defending her, he publicly abandoned her, claiming he couldn't be associated with a traitor to the country. Elena later discovered that John had been one of those who provided evidence against her in exchange for a quick promotion. Destroyed professionally and emotionally, Elena fled to Oakhaven under a new identity. She married Robert Vance, a kind and simple man who never knew about her past, and tried to build a new life. When Robert died in a work accident, she found herself alone with 2 young children and only her natural technical skills to survive. For 20 years, she had buried the pilot she once was. But now, facing the Aurora, something deep inside her roared like an engine returning to life. "Are you sure you want to do this?" asked Dr. Ramirez, his voice trembling. "If something goes wrong." "Nothing will go wrong," Elena replied with a conviction that surprised even herself. "I know what I'm doing." In the next 40 minutes, Elena underwent a basic medical examination, which she passed with surprising ease, was fitted with a flight suit, which she donned with the naturality of someone who had done it 1,000 times, and was briefed on the Aurora systems, about which she demonstrated knowledge that left the instructors speechless. When she finally headed for the aircraft, the entire hangar had transformed into an arena of tense anticipation. Military personnel of all ranks, engineers, technicians, and even some authorized civilians crowded together to witness what many believed would be a spectacular disaster. Captain Dante accompanied her to the cockpit, his face a mask of concern and curiosity. "Elena," he said, using her first name for the first time, "you don't need to prove anything to anyone. If you want to quit—" "Captain," she interrupted him, her eyes shining with a determination he had never seen, "I spent 20 years on the ground. Today, I'm going to fly." She climbed into the Aurora's cockpit with fluid movements, her hands finding the controls as if she had never left them. The instrument panel lit up under her touch, and for a moment Elena felt as if she were returning home after 2 decades of exile. The takeoff was a miracle of technical precision. As the tower controllers held their breath, Elena lifted the Aurora with the gentleness of a feather touched by the wind. The aircraft, which had been an uncontrollable demon in the hands of experienced pilots, responded to her commands like a perfectly synchronized dance partner. In the first few minutes of flight, Elena tested the basic systems, sensing the machine's unique personality. The Aurora wasn't just an aircraft, it was an extension of her own will, a dream in metal and technology that had finally found someone who spoke its language. And then something extraordinary happened. Elena began performing maneuvers that defied not only expectations, but the very laws of aerodynamics everyone thought they knew. She made the Aurora dance in the sky with a grace that seemed impossible for a war machine, performing turns that computers declared impractical and low-altitude flights that left observers' hearts in their throats. In the control tower, the silence was broken only by the tense breathing of those present and the occasional crackle of the radio. Radars showed trajectories no pilot would dare attempt, speeds that challenged safety limits, and altitudes that made the Aurora seem to be playing with gravity. "My God," whispered. 2 years after the day that changed her life, Elena was in her workshop teaching Sophia to disassemble a motorcycle engine when she heard a familiar sound in the sky. It was an Aurora. Not the same one she had flown, but one of the several that now made up the Air Force's experimental fleet. Mother and daughter went out to the backyard and watched the aircraft draw impossible arabesques against the endless blue. Sophia held her mother's hand and asked, "Mom, do you miss flying?" Elena smiled, her eyes following the metallic dance in the heights. "My dear," she replied, "I never stopped flying. I just changed altitude." That night, after the children were asleep, Elena went out to the backyard and looked at the stars. She thought of all the dreams she had buried, of all the injustices she had suffered, of all the times she had doubted her own worth. She also thought of Vasconcelos, who now lived in seclusion, carrying the weight of his exposed crimes. But mainly, she thought about the lesson her journey had taught her, that our true measure isn't in what others think of us, but in how we choose to respond to life's storms, that the greatest victory isn't humiliating our enemies, but transcending our own pain, and that sometimes the strongest wings are those that have been broken and then carefully mended. Elena Vance had proven that genius isn't measured by diplomas or ranks, but by courage, integrity, and the ability to transform scars into wisdom. Her story spread like seeds in the wind, inspiring countless people around the world to never give up on their dreams, no matter how buried they may seem. And every morning, when the sun rose over Oakhaven, Elena looked at the sky and smiled, because she knew she had conquered something far more valuable than any revenge or belated recognition. She had conquered the peace of someone who chose to fly with integrity, even when the whole world conspired to keep her on the ground. The sky, as she had said on that memorable day at Delta Air Force Base, was never the same. But Elena also knew that the most important thing wasn't having changed the sky. It was having discovered that the sky had always been inside her, patiently waiting for the courage to fly again.